Benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 30 of the Secunda Secundae of the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas. The topic for this lecture is mercy, and I am Dr. Thibault. So we are doing the final one of the interior acts of charity, which is mercy. We've already covered peace and joy. And then from here we move into the external acts of charity, which are also a lot of fun. So they're enjoyable to look at the internal and external acts of joy, of charity. So again, only 4 articles for this one, like all the others. Fairly short and not too complicated, so it's kind of a fun one. The first article is mercy motivated by evil? It's almost a shocking type of question, but St. Thomas uses St. Augustine to say, mercy is heartfelt sympathy for another's distress, impelling us to succor him if we can, right? To help him if we can. Heartfelt sympathy for another's distress, impelling us to help in whatever way we can. That's really beautiful. That's almost poetic how nicely it's written. So what's the answer to the question in that? Well, is mercy motivated by evil? Yes, it's motivated by your own heartfelt sympathy towards another person's distress. Well, another person's distress is something which deals with that which is evil, because what distresses us is a failure, a shortcoming, a sin, some type of deficiency of some kind, right? So this is all something dealing with something that's evil, and our mercy compels us to respond, right? How does it compel us to respond? To help in whatever way we can, right? So right now there's all these activities going on to help with Ukraine, the Ukrainian crisis. People trying to help and gather things to send over to the Ukraine, or send money, or whatever you can do. Well, what has motivated this act of mercy? Well, the war, right? It's Putin's attack of the Ukrainian people that has motivated the response, right? If Putin had not attacked Ukraine, we would not be sending help, right? This is quite obvious. So this is another part that's, I think, important in here. Mercy comes from the Latin misericordiae, right? You might have heard that, right? In the Salve or misericordiae, which comes from miser and cor, miserum and cor, right? So it's of the heart, right? That's why it's a heartfelt sympathy. This miserium, right? You can even hear it in it. Miserium is dealing with what we might call misery, right? It's dealing with suffering and distress. Our heart is turned towards another's distress, right? It kind of makes obvious sense, even right from the Latin. Another term that, well, it's the same term. You see very frequently in here. In the English translation, you see mercy, and then you see pity, and then you see mercy and pity, and pity and pity, and mercy and mercy. And they seem to be going back and forth. And when you look at the Latin, you're really finding all the root word of misericordia. So they're fairly interchangeable in terms of the Summa, right? I wondered, you show mercy, you can show pity, maybe, but you more likely take pity. You never take mercy, right? There is a difference in the English language between mercy and pity, but in the Latin it seems fairly interchangeable. If there is a difference that's made in the English distinction of this, it's that pity appears to be slightly more emotional, and mercy that's dealing perhaps a bit more with the heart. But again, the Latin, they're fairly interchangeable. Now there is a difference between just that emotional pitying, right? We get into this later, but it's in this section as well. But there's more than just an emotional pity. You see somebody who's undergoing something sad, and you go, "Oh, that's so sad," and then you move on with your life, right? That is kind of an emotional pity, right? But if you have this misericordia, right, a movement of the heart, right? It's a heartfelt sympathy. It suffers with, right? There's a suffering with the person in their distress, right? That is the virtue here. I won't get into any more because that is also one of the questions. Does pity respond to a defect? It's kind of similar. Does mercy respond to an evil, right? It's kind of similar in question. But St. Thomas unfolds it more. He says, pity is the grief of another's distress, which is also what mercy is, right? Mercy is a grief of another's distress. He says, one grieves or sorrows for another's distress insofar as one looks upon another's distress as one's own. Now this is where it starts becoming more virtuous, right? Why? If you're responding to a defect and you're treating another person's illness, another person's distress, as if it's your own, now we're talking about friendship, right? What is a friend? A friend sees, as the next line says, union of affection. Friend is another self, right? A friend is another self. Right? If you have a friend, you treat your friend as if they are you, right? They're an extension of you. When you help your friend, you help yourself. There's a union we have with friends. So when a friend is pitiable, we pity ourselves, right? And we respond. St. Thomas also points out real union, right? Not just a union of affections, right? Of emotions, but a real union. And this one is a good point. And it's that when somebody has a sense of the real union, you realize that the suffering of your neighbor is your own suffering. It's not that you treat it as your own suffering, but it is your suffering. And he points out that elderly people get this more than younger people. You know, a younger person, he points out, you say, well, you see another suffering and you go, oh, that's so bad. That's too bad for them. But an older person realizes, you know, if that person's suffering, well, that could affect me, right? That could be something about me, you know. So when a younger person sees somebody gets cancer, they go, oh, that's so bad that this person got cancer. But when you're older and you see your friend get cancer, you go, oh, I'm next, right? That could happen to me. Or a friend dies when you're older, you go, you know, we went to high school together and they died. I could die, right? This becomes a sense of union. Versus young people who they see an old person die and they go, oh, I got a lot of time ahead of me, right? I don't have to worry about that. Another piece of this is kind of cause and effect as well, right? So again, if we look at the attack of the war on Ukraine, we could say, oh, that's too bad, but it has nothing to do with me. Well, but then look at the gas prices, look at, you know, the money spent to protect Europe, look at, right, it does affect you, right? Anything that happens on planet Earth has a way of affecting you, right? You could say, well, it has nothing to do with me what's going on in the Middle East. Then 9/11 happens, right? Well, it doesn't bother me what's happening in China. Eventually something will happen and it will affect you. Eventually something with China will have something to do with your own life. There's a guarantee, because we are all on the same planet, we are all members of the human race, and there is a real union between us, right? So pitying another, either because they're our friend or because of a sense of real union, there is a sense of pity, right, in our response to it. It says the people who don't pity, there are people who don't pity. They don't feel bad, and they don't get involved. Right? Who are these people who are unwilling to help, respond with pity? Well, he says the unvirtuous, for one. Those are people. So somebody who's very prideful. Oh, you have you don't have any money and you're unemployed. Well, that's because you're lazy. That's too bad. Oh, you can't afford your medical bills. You should have saved up some money, right? You should have done something else, right? Oh, you got sick. Oh, you should have taken better good care of your health, right? Oh, your car broke down. Oh, you should have brought it to the garage earlier, right? They always have a reason why, well, you're your own fault, right? You're it. And I don't have those problems, right? Doesn't affect me because I do the right thing. Right? Pride would be it. People like that can't sympathize with somebody else, right? Or somebody says, "Oh, I really struggling lately," and then you say, "Well, I was struggling more than you were struggling," right? There's another sense of pride and outdoing one another in successes and failures, right? Outdoing one another. Something we're very good at as people, right? The unvirtuous, right? They don't have healthy moral balance, right? Sense of friendship. Another one is people who are under severe distress already, right? So people who are under extreme distress might not have any pity for someone else, right? If you were undergoing, if you were to say again, all of the Ukrainian wars going on right now, the Ukrainians who are trying to flee and get into Poland and they're trying to protect their families and all of this is going on, if you said, "Oh, what do you think about global warming? What do you think about climate change? This could have a real, effect on climate change." They'll say, "Oh, who cares about climate change, right? It's not my problem." Well, I know somebody who in California, they're homeless and they really struggle. Well, why do I care, right? Why would I care about this? Go tell someone else, right? I have a family member and they have cancer. Well, I'm very sorry for you, but I have other things to worry about in my life right now than your family member. I'm sure they will get the best medical treatment. In the meantime, my family might get blown up in the next few hours. So I apologize for not getting more concerned, right? This is people under extreme distress might not have the empathy left to care about something else, right? This could also happen. There's other times that you could see, like in the Holocaust, there's people who can be under extreme distress and can show tremendous amounts of pity towards other people, but we tend to think of those people as saints, right? Maximilian Kolbe could do that. There's many great saints who could do that, but there's other times when you're under so much distress you don't have the empathy left. The third article is mercy a virtue? Now, if you recall, we've had so far joy and then peace and now mercy. And both for joy and peace, we've said, no, they are not virtues. They are responses. They are acts. That makes sense, right? Because you experience peace. You experience joy. You don't experience mercy. You engage in mercy, right? You show mercy, right? You don't show joy. I guess you can, but that's not the virtuous part. You're showing mercy, right? This is something different. It's almost as a command, right? To show mercy. You're not commanded to show joy or to show peace, right? Maybe show nonviolence, but not to show peace, right? You experience peace, you experience joy, you show mercy, right? You might also be on the receiving side of mercy, but again, the virtue part is showing it. Now, there's two ways of looking at mercy as well. So there's one form in terms of the sensitive appetites, and then in terms of the intellectual appetites. So in terms of the sensitive appetites, this is on the Stations of the Cross. when the women see Jesus battered and beaten, and they cry, and he says to them, "Women, weep not for me, but for your children and your children's children." Right? If you recall the Stations of the Cross, right? Because they had a sensitive appetite of mercy, right? They saw something pitiable, and they had an emotional response to seeing something pitiable, right? See a dog suffering, and right? You look away, right? You're horrified, right? It's an emotional response, right? This is not a virtue, because emotional responses are not virtues, right? The fact that you are disgusted or horrified or repulsed by something is not a virtue. It's an appetite, right? It's an appetite. The intellectual appetite, though, of seeing something pitiable and being moved to help, right? Moved to respond. Now, this isn't a gut thing. This isn't an emotional thing. This is determined by reason, right? You see somebody starving, somebody hungry, and you go and you buy them food and you bring it to them and you show mercy, right? This is not an emotion. This is an action moved by reason, right? Therefore, this is a virtue. It's also, again, why you don't see that for joy, right? There's no similar situation where you could say joy is like that. Peacemaker, you could make it a little bit like that, but again, that would be acting in some ways non-violently. The response then is peace, right? It's the kind of conclusion. The next part of this was kind of an interesting one, and I know it's framed differently, but differently than I'm presenting it a little bit. But is mercy? Well, he says pity is grief for those who suffer undeservedly. Which makes sense, right? Pity is those who you pity who suffer undeservedly. If somebody has chosen to do something to harm themselves, slightly less pity. St. Thomas does point out that some people cause it by accident, right? They have chosen something which is an apparent good, but a consequence is something negative. And his example is choosing a food that will make you unwell, right? You've chosen to eat this fish. The fish has been out for the last 2 days. You eat it and it makes you sick. So you have chosen the fish, but it is the cause of you getting sick. You didn't say, I'm going to get sick. You said, I'm going to eat this fish, right? So in those ways, you can pity people like that too, right? Because they didn't will the bad, right? If you will the bad, then there's no pity and there's no mercy, right? There's it's not the same. So in this response, nemesis. Now, we tend to think of nemesis as one's enemy, right? I think that's more how it's commonly used, is one's nemesis is one's antagonist. The enemy of Batman is the Joker or the Penguin, right? The nemesis, right? The bad guy, right? That we tend to think of him as the bad guy. In this classical approach, though, nemesis is not the bad guy. And nemesis is rejoicing when they suffer deservedly. So this is the proper response when somebody suffers deservedly. So, as an example, back to the war in Ukraine. So Putin has waged this war against Ukraine, and not so much the Russian people, but Putin, right? Vladimir Putin has done this. Who knows how this is going to end? It might not end too well for Vladimir Putin. If, for example, it ends in him being assassinated or getting arrested and put on trial at the ICC, or he's deposed by his own people. We don't know how it's going to end at this point, as the time I'm filming this. But if one of those negative things happens, an assassination, prison, deposed, something like this, something bad happens to Vladimir Putin that he deserves, right? Then we rejoice. I know this doesn't seem like the traditional thing you hear as Christians, but when an evildoer, somebody is choosing evil, they have desired evil, they choose evil, when they suffer deservedly, they deserve to suffer and they are suffering, the response is rejoice. Right? So, is that still mercy? Yes, it's still mercy, even when it's rejoicing. St. Thomas points out, from taking it from Aristotle, both of these are praiseworthy and come from the same disposition of character. They are both parts of mercy. So, two parts of mercy are pity, which leads to action, right? Not just the emotion, and nemesis, right? Somebody's house burns down, pity, right? Mercy. When somebody is an evil person who burned down the house and they get arrested, we are happy. We're happy that the bad person got arrested, right? We rejoice in that. Why? Well, because of justice, right? Mercy is not really as contrary to justice as a lot of people pretend it is, right? Mercy is the opposite of justice. Not so much with Thomas Aquinas, right? It's not so much. Justice is part of mercy, right? To act merciful, to judge mercifully, is to judge correctly, right? To show pity where pity is deserved, and to show punishment where it's deserved as well, right? Both are parts of mercy. Is mercy the greatest virtue? Well, this depends on how you interpret it, right? So, in some ways, when we move ahead to the cardinal virtues, St. Thomas asks all the time, is this the greatest virtue? Is this the greatest virtue? And the answer is always, it can't, the cardinal virtues cannot be the greatest virtue, because the greatest virtues are the theological virtues, because they aim at God directly, right? So because the theological virtues aim at God correctly, they are the greatest, right? So throughout the cardinal virtues. And then from the the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. Okay, now we're down to the greatest virtue will be found in love. So of love, is mercy the greatest part of love? And in some ways, yes, right? In some ways, yes. So in itself, when we look at mercy in itself, it binds itself to the suffering of others and helps, right? So you're binding yourself to the suffering of others and helps. Who does that sound like? Jesus, right? It sounds like God himself. It sounds like the act of God himself, because God is merciful. God is mercy. God binds himself to the suffering of others and helps. If we also bind ourselves to the suffering of others and help, we are merciful and we are godlike in that action. In that way, it is the greatest virtue, right? It is great. But then St. Thomas says, in terms of the object, it is not the greatest virtue. So charity, for example, is aimed at God, right? The enjoyment of God for God's own sake, right? The attainment of God, the resting in God, the friendship, intimate friendship with God. That's what charity is. Well, that's the greatest. That's the greatest. What is mercy's object? What is it directed towards? Binding yourself with your neighbor. What's better? Binding yourself with your neighbor or binding yourself with God? Binding yourself with God. So charity itself as an object, focus of an object, is better than mercy, right? So charity. But mercy is part of charity, so it's not really a contradiction to say one is different than the other, right, in terms of greatness. Charity is the greatest. Sometimes, depending on how you're looking at it, mercy is great. It's the greatest part of charity. in terms of your neighbor, it's the greatest virtue for the sake of your neighbor, right? Of all virtues that are directed towards our neighbor, justice or prudence or amiability or liberality, or all the cardinal virtues that we could look at and all the parts of the cardinal virtues, mercy is the greatest, because it's not just acting on our neighbor or acting for our neighbor. It's binding ourselves with our neighbor and suffering and helping with our neighbor. It's a joining of hearts with a suffering person. In some ways, that's much greater than anything you can do to or for the person. In that way, it is a form of perfected charity. It is the greatest of charity. This is an important section, so it has 2 pages. Sacrifice to God is not for God's sake, but also for our neighbor and for ourselves. So St. Thomas points that out. Right? So why do we offer sacrifice to God liturgically or ritually or any other way, right? Why do we say, I'm not going to eat cake during Lent for God? Well, does God need this? St. Thomas says, no, nothing we can do can add to God. All of this ends up working towards the good of our neighbor and the good of ourselves. God also says in the scriptures, God wishes for them to be offered to Him in order to arouse our devotion and our profit our neighbor. I have desired mercy, not sacrifice. So again, this shows, in some ways, it is the greatest commandment, right? Mercy, because the sacrifices aimed at God is great, right? Worship of God directly is great, right? Like charity. But Jesus Himself says, the greatest sacrifice you can offer me is mercy, right? Better than even worship of the one true God is mercy for His sake. Right? So again, kind of points towards mercy being the greatest virtue. Said that this is a great line as well. The sum total of Christian religion consists in mercy as regards external works and the inward love of charity. I think that's another great line from St. Thomas. The sum total of the Christian religion consists in mercy as regards to external works and inward love of charity. Right? So how do we be the most excellent and perfect Christian? To love with charity and to act with mercy. Well, isn't that great? Right? Is that hard? Is Christianity that hard? Is figuring out God that hard? What does God want? Charity, which is the love of God, to enjoy the love of God, and for it to extend to your neighbor, and to show mercy to your neighbor, join yourself. Right? The entire gospel could be summed up in this one sentence. Isn't that something? I think it's magnificent, right, that St. Thomas has done this. In conclusion, mercy is motivated by evil, right? It's a response to evil. Pity responds to a defect in some way, right? The deficiency allows us to unite ourselves to the person who is pitiable, right, to help. Mercy is a virtue. It acts towards a good, right? And mercy is the greatest virtue, in a sense, right? In itself, it is, in terms of its object. Charity is greater, but mercy is part of charity, so it kind of ties together. And Jesus Himself says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and yet He does ask for sacrifice, so He wants even more mercy. Right? Okay, next we will move on to the external acts of charity. Right? Those are the next 3.